Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to the channel. Dylan here. We have a major bombshell today from Vice President J.D. Vance. He just came out to address the nation about what's going on in the world with Iran, what's going on with the new anti-fraud initiative, and he's exposing the truth about the Democrats, okay? So we're going to dive into this, but before we do, we're going to read scripture and pray because God comes first. Amen? Comment amen if you believe that. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them. For the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Amen. Remember, my brothers and sisters, that God is with you, whether you realize it or not. Everywhere you go, He is with you. Amen. All right, guys, so here's J.D. Vance coming out to speak, giving an update on Iran. So let's tune in, my friend.
It's Saturday in America. I'm Kayleigh McEnany, and in moments, you will hear my exclusive interview with the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance. It was wide-ranging. We spoke about everything from Trump's efforts to finally put an end to the Iran war, to the administration, which is now calling for Congress to do its part in protecting taxpayer dollars, your money, from being stolen by fraudsters. The vice president also responded directly to a comment that was made about him by the Democratic Senate candidate from Michigan, Abdul El Sayed. It was pretty personal. In the vice president's new book, Communion, which details his journey from atheism back to Christianity.
Whoa, we need to support this new book, my friends, or just support and say a prayer for J.D. Vance. The Vice President of America sharing his testimony about how he found God. Wow, that's powerful. That's powerful. Because just a few years ago, we had freaking Kamala Harris in there who was yelling at people who were saying Christ is King. Remember that? Kicking them out of her event. It was two young Christian men. Said, Christ is King, Christ is Lord. And she said, oh, you guys are at the wrong rally. While she was talking about abortions.
Now, my interview with the Vice President.
Crazy.
Vice President J.D. Vance, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Of course. I'm going to get to your extraordinary book here in a moment. I read it. I'm very taken with the stories, and I'm fascinated by it. But I do want to start, Vice President, with some news of the day. And there was big news that you were in the Senate this week. You went to a lunch with senators. Iran dominated the conversation. So I was hoping you could give us a readout of that meeting.
Yeah, well, love to go and hang out with some of my old GOP colleagues in the United States Senate. Great guys, people who are trying to do the right thing by the country. We talked about a number of issues. We talked about the budget reconciliation legislation that we're working on. Obviously, the president's priority right now is to get the Save America Act passed. I think it's absurd that we're the most advanced democracy in the entire world, and yet we don't have voter ID. That really has to change. We also, of course, talked a lot about Iran. And where Iran is today, Kayleigh, is that we're talking to the Iranians, of course. We're trying to maximize the amount of oil and gas that are coming out of the Strait of Hormuz. That's the thing that we're most focused on right now. And you see, I think oil prices dipping around $80 a barrel today, sometimes a little bit lower. So we're just trying to make sure that we get what we need out of this particular conflict. If you go back and remember what it is that we've done here, we've destroyed their nuclear program. We've destroyed their conventional military. We've radically reduced their, what you might call their asymmetric military abilities. And right now we're trying to see if they're willing to make the kind of long-term changes that would be necessary to have a better relationship with the United States. And if not, that's fine too. We're just going to keep on applying the pressure that we can apply and getting as much oil and gas out of the Middle East so that Americans can enjoy lower gas and energy prices. So that's the delicate dance. The final thing I'll say about this, Kayleigh, is I try to remind people that we're really in the middle of the game here. This thing is not over. It's obviously not at the beginning. We're in the middle of the game, and we're applying a whole host of tools, diplomatic, economic, military tools, to ensure that we get the best outcome for the American people. I feel quite confident we will get there, but we're still a bit in the middle of the game.
So, still in the middle of the game? That's actually surprising for me, and this is one of the reasons why a lot of conservatives are not fans of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, because, well, mainly Donald Trump, really, because J.D. Vance has to support Trump. I mean, Mike Pence didn't really support Trump, but that's a whole other story. But a lot of conservatives, they're like, we were promised no wars, and now, keep saying, oh, the war's going to end, and now J.D. Vance is coming out and saying we're still in the middle of the game. It's pissing off a lot of Republicans, I'll put it that way. But, I mean, hey, what do you guys think? Comment below.
And the Iranians, through different methods, have broadcasted that they look to tighten their grip on the Strait of Hormuz. So in a theoretical deal, what would an acceptable status quo be for the Strait?
Well, our expectation is you're going to see the same amount of oil and gas come out of the Gulf that you saw before the conflict started. That is what the Iranians have told us that they are going to do. That's what the entire Gulf coalition wants to do as well. But, you know, we don't trust, we verify. We actually look not at people's words, but at people's deeds. You see some people within the Iranian system, of course, talk about tolling. The Iranians have told us they have no plans to toll the Strait of Hormuz. But again, we're going to see what actions actually happen. What's been going on for the past week or so is that the Iranians and the Gulf countries, particularly Oman, have been talking about how to ensure the safe flow of traffic. The one problem, of course, is the Iranians laid a large number of mines at the beginning of the war. And so what we're really working through now is how you can actually set up a traffic scheme so that the ships that pass can pass through safely. That includes, of course, demining. That also includes a commitment from the Iranians that they're not going to fire at commercial vessels. They're hurting in a big way. They want this thing to be over. The question is whether their system is able to give the things that are necessary for us to be happy, for us to feel like we've gotten what we need out of this particular engagement. That is still to be determined, but I do think that we've made some progress over the last few days.
So to domestic politics, you had some policy critiques, some very fair ones, of El Sayed, of course, the Democratic nominee for Senate in Michigan. Rather than responding to your policy critiques, here's how he responded. Listen to this.
Is that Peter Thiel's boy with that Ohio charisma he's got? That guy. I think we've had enough of him. The last thing that he said that made any sense was hillbilly elegy. After he said that Donald Trump had no business being president of anything, that was the last time he made sense, and then he decided to suck up to power.
What's your response?
Well, look, I don't pay that guy much mind. The problem with El Sayed.
Who is El Sayed? Have you guys heard of him yet? I've been, honestly, a lot of you guys have been commenting, where have I been? I took like 3 to 4 weeks off, visited, family, took some time for myself. I don't know who El Sayed is, so let me know if you guys do. And by the way, I'm so happy to be back and see you all in the comments. I appreciate you guys so very much. I just needed a little bit of a break in family time.
Is that he is a person who claims to stand for working people, and yet he opposed Donald Trump's policies that have quite literally saved the Michigan auto industry. This is not a guy who wants a prosperous economy where auto workers and everybody else can actually raise a family, ideally on a single wage if they so choose. What he is actually trying to build is an economy where you tax some people, you give it to Democratic Party favored interest groups, and that's just not how you create prosperity. You create prosperity by actually rebuilding the middle class in this country, rebuilding the industrial foundation of middle class prosperity. So, of course, he's going to make personal insults. He's also gone after my kids. He's just kind of an odd guy. But I think that it's telling that instead of talking about what he wants to do to make the lives of Michiganders better, he takes personal insults at me. I'm the vice president. It comes with the territory. I think the guy's crazy and would be a terrible senator for the people of Michigan. We're going to make that case, and obviously the people of Michigan are going to make their vote.
And one thing that he doesn't talk about too often, but you certainly do, is fraud. And the American people care deeply about it. I watched your fraud roundtable, the task force, with great interest this week. You laid out a 3-part plan for Congress to help out with this. And one of the interesting points was data sharing and forcing Democratic states to share their data with you. I'm curious why you would need legislation to force Democrats to combat fraud. I would think they would willingly turn this information over to you.
You would think so, Kaylee, but unfortunately, too much of the Democratic Party boss runs on the money that comes from fraud. The NGO network, the political parties, some of the nonprofit organizations in these blue states, they actually depend on the fraud to fund their operations. And to explain this a little bit to the American people, Kaylee, the craziest thing, I was literally shocked by this the first time that I realized that when we send, for example, $8 billion to the state of California to run their food stamp program, they don't even verify eligibility. You could have illegal aliens on that program. We have no sense at the federal government. We send them $8 billion. It goes out the door, and we have no way of confirming whether the state of California is actually spending that on needy Americans, because, of course, we want to help people who can't afford a bite to eat. But the program is not there for illegal aliens. It's not there for fraudsters. And what California and so many blue states have done is really turn down the eligibility requirements, turn down the verification requirements, and we unfortunately are just going to have to force them into some basic stuff. Things like checking when somebody signs up for food stamps. Are they in this country legally? Do they actually have proper photo identification? Have they committed a terrible felony in the last couple of years? Basic eligibility checks that so many blue states are not doing. So we're going to have to force them to do that. And that's one of the things we've talked about with our congressional colleagues, is just forcing some of these blue states to share the data. I will say, Kaylee, in the defense of some blue states, some Democrats have been willing to work with us because they recognize that fighting fraud should be a bipartisan issue. Unfortunately, you've got the Californias and the New Yorks of the world who seem to want their states to be defrauded by the fraudsters, but we can't let that happen. It's gone on for too long, and the president has asked us to stop it. We're finally taking it seriously.
I find it so freaking annoying and inefficient that our country doesn't check in on those things. All these government programs, all these nonprofits, all these NGOs, all these lobbyists, there's so much money being flown around every day. We don't even know where it's going. That's a joke.
Have any Senate Democrats called you and said, hey, how can we help with these legislative priorities?
I'm not holding my breath, Kaylee. Unfortunately, the Senate Democrats are too captured, I think, by the far left of their own party. Where you've had Democrats work with us, it's local officials, state officials, some attorneys generals whose job it is to prosecute the fraud. And so they realize how terrible the problem is. But unfortunately, Kaylee, this is the story of the National Democratic Party leadership. They won't do the things that even their own voters want them to do. You ask about fraud. I think one of the most serious frauds in our country is voter fraud. 80% of Democrats would love to see voter ID, but we can't get a single Democrat to help us with the Save America Act. I don't think, unfortunately, we're going to have too many Senate Democrats who are trying to stop the fraud. It's a shame because I'd love to work with them.
It is. Well, to your extraordinary book, Communion, I loved reading this because as I started reading this, your upbringing, at least theologically, reminded me of my upbringing. I was an evangelical Christian. I read Tim LaHaye. I read C.S. Lewis. I went to Young Life. These were all things that were a part of my life, and they were a part of yours. And then there was this turn to atheism for a few years, and I'm wondering if you could tell me how that happened.
And by the way, Young Life, that's a youth group ministry where it's actually really good. If you guys ever want to donate, check out Young Life. They basically do church groups for youth at churches around the country. So that's actually pretty cool.
I think a couple things happened, Kaylee. First of all, because I did have some foundation in my faith, but it wasn't really connected to a particular church or a particular institution. It was connected to my grandmother. She was the person who read the Bible to me. She was the person that I talked to God about. And so when she passed away shortly before I left for Iraq in 2005, I just lost that connection to my faith. And without being properly rooted, I lost my faith altogether. And I think what happened to me, Kaylee, is that I realized that I went through this, what I would call an arrogant atheist phase, where I didn't just not believe in God, but I sort of thought that I knew better than other people who did, is that I realized that wasn't making me a good person. It was making me worried about, where I went to school and how much money I made and all these sort of worldly pursuits. They were making me very successful. I was getting good jobs. I was going to good schools, but they weren't making me a good human being. And the more that I thought about what is it that actually makes a person good and virtuous, what are the things that actually matter, the more I realized that, these Christians that I kind of dismissed for a period of my life, they actually had their act together. And if they had their act together, maybe it was rooted in some truth about the divinity of Jesus Christ, about the fact that he came and died for us. And so I started to be curious in Christianity because I saw the truth of Christianity reflected in a lot of people around me.
Yeah, and the way you described this, I thought it was so interesting because it was not this epiphany of, wow, atheists are correct intellectually. I've been brainwashed in a classroom. You describe it as it's not hearing an anti-Christian worldview every morning in college lectures. It's having a routine Christian existence replaced by something different. I'm curious if your return to Christianity, to Catholicism, was that incremental or was there an aha moment?
It was very incremental. I've never had an epiphany, Kaylee, though I've certainly had these moments where I felt the presence of God. I talk, for example, about this, moment that I had at a conference where a friend and I were talking about Christianity and talking about Catholicism, and there was this moment where a glass fell off the wall at the point of our conversation.
Whoa.
Where, I think an atheist would dismiss that as, oh, who cares, a glass fell off the wall. But at that moment, it felt like God was trying to send me a message. You have these little moments like this, but I never had an epiphany. What I did is have this slow realization that Christianity was true. And it really did start with this recognition, Kaylee, that so many of the Christians that I saw around me, obviously we're all imperfect people, but they had their act together. They were focused on the things that really mattered. I didn't care, and frankly, my wife didn't care whether I was super successful, whether I became the vice president or a best-selling author or successful in business. She just wanted me to be a good man, and I wanted to be a good husband and a good father. And I felt like Christianity answered that yearning better than anything else that I saw in the world. And that really is what led me back, but it was a slow process.
I will say, I actually really relate to that a lot more than people who say, oh, I had this wild experience and God spoke to me, he called me by my name, and listen, those are amazing as well. But JD Vance just being like, yeah, no, I didn't have a crazy moment. It just slowly grew on me. To me, that speaks to me more, because I'm like, that makes it more realistic for me, because I'm someone where I don't have those crazy experiences, but he wants to be a good guy. He thinks Christianity is for him. He's had these little moments here and there where he's felt God. I'm like, I think that's a powerful testimony. If you feel comfortable sharing your own testimony, share it in the comment section below and read each other's and upvote the other ones too. If you see it, respond to each other. Let's get connected as a community. Share your testimony down below if you're comfortable. If not, no worries.
Yeah, no doubt Christianity holds the answer. There was also a moment in your book that I was fascinated by, and it's a car incident that you had. You were driving back from Mama's funeral, and I hope that you could tell me this story, and you almost got into a car accident, but you didn't. And I'm wondering if you could share that story and then answer if you thought that was supernatural.
Yeah, so I definitely do think it was supernatural. I mean, I talk about, this quote from the movie Pulp Fiction that what matters is not whether it's an according to Hoyle miracle. What matters is whether you feel the touch of God. And what happened to me, Kaylee, is I was returning from my grandmother's funeral in eastern Kentucky. I was driving back to my Marine Corps base in North Carolina, and I was on one of these sort of narrow mountain backcountry roads, and I kind of came around a corner. I guess it had been raining, and I was going a little bit too fast. And it was one of these moments where, the car is spinning. You don't know when it's going to stop, and if it doesn't stop, you're going to tumble over the mountain and be seriously injured or worse. But the car came to this perfectly gentle stop right as I was about to fall over the mountain. And again, maybe the laws of physics can explain what happened, but in that moment, I felt the touch of God. And I think my own attitude on this, Kaylee, I've talked to a lot of friends, atheists and Christians about this, is that God is always sending us these little messages. It's not necessarily with a megaphone. It doesn't necessarily smack you across the face, but there are all of these subtle moments where I think God tries to speak to us. That was certainly one of those moments for me.
Well, it's a great book. We encourage everyone to buy a copy of Communion. Vice President JD Vance, thank you so much for your time.
Wow, I actually really want to buy that book, Communion. I actually really enjoyed this clip when JD Vance was on the Joe Rogan podcast, where he talks about why young Americans are turning to socialism. He's exposing the truth here. So let's listen in, my friends.
Well, anybody who doesn't want to eat ice cream is a communist. There's nothing wrong with ice cream. Ice cream. Speaking of communists,
the Democratic Socialists of America, that's actually what they do at their events, is they throw the ice cream into the Boston Harbor instead of the tea.
Yeah, those fucking people scare me. I'm really concerned that people think that's a good idea, and that they think that socialism just hasn't been done correctly. That
Correct.
drives me nuts, because I think a lot of really well-intentioned, really kind and empathetic young people think that that's the way to go. And I do not think they understand the dangers of this ideology, because it always leads to one thing. It leads to a very powerful military government that controls the population, period, End of discussion. And if you play it out, it is literally the only way they can get people to give up their money.
Yes.
It's the only way they can get them to give up their property. And when you're hearing like Mamdani talk about freezing rents and taking bad landlords and then confiscating their property, you're like, this is step one of what's happened in every communist dictatorship throughout history.
Yeah.
This is what happened in North Korea. Give the government the land, and we'll make sure that no one ever has to worry about food. What a great idea.
Yeah, man.
Look how it turned out.
So I don't know who said this, but the whole argument of communism is that you seize the means of production, but because the means of production...
Oh, seizing the means of production. Because if you think about, like, North Korea, it's like, they can't make it out. Like, you're kind of stuck where you are. I don't know if that's communism in North Korea, but, like, people who live there, they can't escape the society. They can't really rise. You're kind of stuck where you are. And the people in power, they're like the consistent ones.
The most powerful means of production is the human mind. You ultimately have to get into totalitarianism.
Yes.
You have to have control of that most fundamental element of the human person.
You also take away motivation.
Correct.
And there's a thing that people don't like, which is extreme wealth. But you have to understand that if it wasn't for the motivation of extreme wealth,
Yes.
you would not have an iPhone.
So
You wouldn't have these things.
Okay, so here's let me give you my my Christian answer to this, and it's a good plug for my new book, Communion, Finding My Way Back to Faith.
Not to be confused with Whitley Strieber's book, Communion, which is all about aliens.
Okay,
Did you know that?
No.
He wrote a
Interesting
book.
coincidence, Joe.
Pull up the
Interesting
cover of
coincidence.
Communion.
Pull up pull up the cover of the Good
Whitley
Communion. That I want all
Communion.
your listeners to buy.
The problem is, you didn't know about this book.
I
would
did
have
not.
told you to come up with a different title.
Seriously, I should have
That's
told
Whitley
you.
Strieber's book.
Oh,
And
there
then
we
look at
go.
yours
Okay,
right
so
next
we
to it.
want
See?
that is wild.
And then there's another one, My First Communion.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's like a kid's book. But yeah, we want people to buy the second one, the one that says J.D. Vance on it. But
Yeah.
Okay, so
That's hilarious, guys.
one of the things I talk about in the book is like there is a Christian idea of political economy that's actually been lost in American politics, where it's like we think of it as libertarianism, the hardcore free market, versus socialism or communism. And
I actually didn't realize this podcast was just 3 weeks ago released. I didn't know that JD went back on the Joe Rogan podcast. He's literally wearing like the same suit as the first one that was over a year ago. So that's why I thought it was the same literal video, but it's not at all.
there actually is a third way that has existed in pretty much all Christian economic thinking going back 2,000 years ago, which is that...
Like, look at the thumbnail. That's why I thought it was the same one. You guys got to take a look at the date here. 1 year ago, 3 weeks ago. He literally, it's like, he literally hasn't aged a minute in a year. Look at JD Vance, guys. Almost the same exact suit, just different colored tie. And different pin, or the pin is... But look, even the face is the same. That's funny.
Yeah, extreme wealth inequality does create problems, but you still got to have private property. You still have to have a state that protects private property rights, and there's a way to balance these things that I think we've sort of lost in our country a little bit. And when I like, okay, let me play devil's advocate with the DSA, because I think that their ideas are crazy, and I think that you're right. They will lead to a very totalitarian place. I'm not defending a single thing that they say, particularly their hatred of ice cream. What I am saying is, and maybe this is just sort of the way my mind works, I tend to be a little bit more empathetic. Why are young people attracted to socialism in 21st century America? One of the best interviews that Charlie Kirk ever gave, it was right before he died. It was an episode that he did with Tucker Carlson where he talked about the fact that if you don't give young people a stake, if you don't give them ownership, if you don't give them a sense of the American dream and of possibility in the future, they're going to become socialists. Like if you have a zero-sum environment for a 25-year-old in this country, they're going to start to say the only way for me to get anything is to take away from somebody else. So we have to get away from like the zero-sum thinking. I think that's like the root cause of this. But I also think that, look, we've ran an experiment in the United States of America. And, you know, I think that we have undone that experiment, taken it in a different direction in the Trump administration, where ship all the factories overseas and let low-wage foreigners make our stuff. That was a bad deal for American workers. Again, it takes a long time to reverse that trend, but I think it's one of the best parts of Trump administration policy is you do see that trend starting to reverse. This idea that nobody should own anything, we should all become renters, whereas what we're trying to do is lower interest rates. You actually have seen housing costs stabilize in the country over the last year and a half, frankly, because of immigration. We had way too many people going after way too many homes. You close the border. This is one of the reasons why rents and housing costs have stabilized a little bit. So I think that unless you go down that pathway of allowing young Americans to own something, socialism is the inevitable outcome. Do I think that's good? No. But I really do worry, and I see this, frankly, more in my own party than I do on the other side. There's this revulsion to socialism that's totally justified without enough thinking about how did we get here in the first place.
Right.
And if we don't fix that, and I would say if we don't get back to a more Christian sort of understanding of economics, socialism is the alternative. Like that is where this goes.
Well,
if people don't
think
own
the
anything,
game is rigged.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in some ways, Joe, the game is rigged.
Yes.
Whoa, he just admitted it, guys. That's insider info.
I mean,
Yes.
if you look at, I mean, again, I think so much of housing because, you know, this happened, I think it was during the presidential campaign, maybe it was right before. But I was talking to some family members over Thanksgiving, and, you know, just a sort of a younger friend of my wife's. They were like 5 or 6 years behind us. They were just about to get married. And this young woman, successful engineer, makes a higher salary than most Americans. She just sort of like tossed out there that, you know, when her parents' generation was coming up, it was like possible to own a house and to raise a family and not be worried that much about things. And my thought was, okay, you're an engineer. You make way more money than 75% of people your age, maybe 90% of people your age. And you think that it is like this ridiculous, unachievable objective to have literally what your parents had, which is a decent job, a nice house, and a safe place. Like, at that same dinner, like another friend of my wife's was talking about this, and he, you know, South Indian family, grew up, you know, his parents immigrated. He was born and raised in San Diego, and he was like, you know, when I was growing up in Oceanside, this is like a suburb of San Diego where there are a lot of Marines live in Oceanside. It's close to Camp Pendleton.
Whoa, I didn't know J.D. Vance grew up there.
So when I was growing up, all of my, like the kids that I played with, that I rode bikes with, that I was, you know, playing street hockey with and football with, all of those kids were the sons of enlisted Marines in Oceanside, California.
Wow.
And then we went and looked at like Oceanside, California rents. Again, this is a couple years ago, rents and housing prices. Like every house was north of $1 million on the street this guy grew up in. And enlisted Marine, frankly, most Marine officers could not afford to buy $1 million house. So like, does the socialism thing scare me? Yes. Is it the wrong solution? Yes. But one thing I try to persuade my fellow Republicans of is socialism is the alternative if we don't have a pathway to give people a sense that the system is not rigged and that the American dream is attainable. That's like our job. That's what we have to do. I'm not saying Rome was built in a day. It's not going to be easy to undo some of these economic trends. But man, we ran the experiment. We ran the experiment of offshoring all of our industrial jobs, of becoming a services and finance economy, and allowing Wall Street to come in and buy every asset of modern life and turn it into an investable, you know, line goes up asset. And what has that done? It's created a generation of kids who kind of are attracted to socialism.
Whoa. That was an incredible breakdown.
Mr. Vice President, thank you for joining us tonight.
Of course. Good to see you.
So Abdul al-Sayed was outspent like 9-1 in Michigan, but
Sure.
he still edged out a victory over Haley Stevens.
That's right.
What does this tell us?
Well, I think it says a couple things. First of all, the base of the Democratic Party just wants radicals. It wants these DSA types. It wants people who hate even the idea of private property ownership. But it also, I think, tells us that that particular set of ideas is very popular in places you wouldn't expect. Because al-Sayed, he's this guy who holds himself out as a working class hero, as a guy who's going to fight for the working class. How does he fight for the working class? By flooding his state and his country with low-wage immigrants. Of course, those people will drive down the wages of the working class. And he also doesn't want to do anything to protect the Michigan auto industry. He has fought against the Trump tariffs that have saved the Michigan auto industry. So interestingly, as much as the media will pull this guy out as a socialist, as a guy who's trying to stand up for the working man, where did he do the best? He did the best among wealthy white liberals and among new immigrants to the United States of America. He basically represents the modern Democratic coalition, which is self-hating white liberals united to people who just came to the country for the first time and don't actually have the sense of appreciation for it that they should. Those are the people who are voting for al-Sayed. He doesn't have a constituency among the working class he pretends to represent.
She won the working class enclaves last night.
Exactly.
And he actually won the more affluent, more highly educated sections of the state. What does that tell us about education in the United States, especially at the university, college, and high school level?
Well, I think what it tells us is that a lot of young Americans were sold a whole promise at the elite universities in our country. And that promise is that they were going to be able to go to college, get a degree, and everything was going to work out fine for them. I think in reality, actually, a lot of universities sold these kids a bill of goods. They gave them a lot of debt. They did not give them useful skills or a useful credential. And a lot of these kids are very angry. But that really is, if you look at the data, Laura, the base of the Democratic Party today is downwardly mobile, hyper-progressive, well-educated people. People, I think, who were sold a bill of goods by universities have a lot of debt, but not a good job to show for it.
What do you guys think? We got 3 months till the midterms. Do you think Republicans are going to hold a majority in the House and the Senate? Or do you think Democrats are going to flip that and Democrats are going to gain a majority in the House or Senate? Comment below.
Say they can't afford a home. The average home ownership is up to like 42 years of age. 10, 15 years ago, it was much lower. There's concern about the cost of living, still high energy prices, $100 to fill my tank today. What does the Republican Party, specifically the administration, need to do better on that front? Because there are real strains out there.
Well, I think that what it shows is that the past 40 years of economic policy, bipartisan economic policy, have failed. I think a lot of people look at al-Sayed or a lot of these other radical candidates and they say socialism is evil. They're right. Socialism is evil. But we have to ask ourselves the question, why is socialism so appealing to a lot of people who, to your point, have lower assets, who don't have the same ownership, who went to universities and were sold a bill of goods?
Because when you think of socialism, you think everything's free. It's like that guy running for class president in high school who's saying, oh, we're getting free soda for everyone. But really, he's just raising everyone's tuition.
They got a lot of debt, but they didn't necessarily get the good jobs that came along with that high debt load. And I think our answer to that, and by the way, you've already seen a lot of it in the Trump administration, is number one, protect American manufacturing. The manufacturing economy is the foundation of the middle class. We see this in Europe. We saw it in the United States. Every country that sells its industrial base to the highest foreign bidder loses its middle class and sees socialism come on the back end. What I think is actually going to happen is these socialist candidates, they've caught the tail end of an economy that wasn't working for most Americans. Unfortunately for them, the Trump economy has made long-term investments in rebuilding that manufacturing base and making America energy independent and actually making it possible to own a home, to have a family, to build the real elements of middle-class life.
The manufacturing numbers that came out this week were unbelievable. The trade deficit cut, exports up. So
yes, and that, by the way, Laura, 40 years of bad economic policy, you're not going to fix that in 18 months. But what you're seeing with the president is trillions of dollars in new investment, new factories being built, the manufacturing numbers are coming back in a big way. That is how you fight socialism, by actually giving people a middle class opportunity.
Who's beating us in the
that
G7?
Is better.
Who's beating us in the G7?
Nobody is
beating us. How about Canada? How are they doing?
They're doing terribly.
So they want us to copy France, Canada, and other countries that are failing? How does that work?
Well, the way that it works, and this is exactly what al-Sayed and these limousine socialists are actually selling to the American people, they're not promising you industry. They're not promising you good jobs. They're not promising self-sufficiency and a good industrial economy. What they're promising is redistribution. Again, we've seen this in Europe and in the United States. The idea that you can build real prosperity by just redistributing assets from one group to another group, that's not how you build real prosperity. You have to actually ultimately sustain the foundation of the economy. That is what the President of the United States has worked us towards for the past 18 months. It's going to continue to pay dividends. But I think, again, Laura, this is an important point. A lot of Americans look at this rising tide of socialism and say, how did we get here? We got here by 40 years of bipartisan leaders selling our industrial base to foreign countries, allowing low-wage immigrants to come in and compete with Americans for jobs, by destroying the foundation of the middle class. That's how you got socialism. How you fix that problem is by doubling down on Donald Trump's economic nationalism.
And we see with the economic nationalism and what's going on in our nation is that everyone who's been investing in the stock market, for instance, we've been seeing the economy and the stocks actually rise under Donald Trump's administration. JD Vance actually talking about the anti-fraud initiative. This is huge breaking news. Let's tune in, guys.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to see you all. And we are here to kick off what has at this point been an informal effort, which is working with Congress to help us combat fraud. So as you know, when the President of the United States started the Fraud Task Force and really set the federal government to taking a whole-of-government approach to the anti-fraud issue, that was mainly an administrative thing. That was something we were working with our colleagues at H&HS, at DOJ, at all of the various agencies of the federal government in trying to root out fraud. And I'd remind all of you and remind the American people and remind what these congressmen and senators don't need reminding, which is that fraud is really a dual victim crime. The most obvious victim, of course, is the American taxpayer, who has their hard-earned tax dollars stolen from them to enrich people who are violating our laws and taking advantage of our country. But I think more profoundly and more sadly, the second victim of fraud are the people who benefit from programs that the American people have set up in their generosity and in their kindness of spirit, and those programs don't function as well or don't even have the resources necessary to work because they've been stolen from by fraudsters. I think an example that is particularly close to my heart because we have a 2-week-old newborn at home is a program that we set up through the Medicaid program to actually provide high-quality health care to new moms and to newborn infants. To people who can't afford high-quality health care, we, as a generous nation, ensure that they have access to the resources that they need. And yet, we have, working with DOJ and others, we have identified, prosecuted a number of cases of people where they have taken from this program, not provided an ounce of service to a new mom or a young baby, and enriched themselves by literally taking money from the medical care of newborn infants. This is despicable behavior, and it's something that we've allowed to go on for too long in the United States of America. I'm very proud that you could not just look at these sort of qualitative stories about what's going on, but we can actually measure the success of the Fraud Task Force. Working with Andrew Ferguson and with Steve Miller, two of the great all-stars of the Trump administration, we have been able to identify $230 billion of fraud just since the Fraud Task Force was set up. And that's frankly by conservatively estimating it. Andrew and I had a meeting in my office last week, and he said, do you want to estimate it conservatively or do you want to estimate it aggressively? And I said, well, I kind of want to estimate it aggressively, but then all you people will criticize us. So let's estimate it conservatively so that we can give the American people the most rock-solid explanation of how this task force is working to protect their money. We've been able to stop $56 billion in fraudulent payments that would have otherwise gone to fraudsters rather than to the people who need them. And in the process, we've saved, obviously, the American people a lot of money. But as much as we've done and as much as we've had great successes, and this brings me to my final point before I kick it over to Andrew, this effort will fundamentally always have a limitation unless our colleagues in the House and the Senate are working with us. We don't want the next administration, whoever, God forbid, you're going to have President El Sayed in 3 years. We don't want him to undo all the incredible work that we've been doing when we've been taking out the fraudsters and saving the American people money. And in order to make this really work, we need our colleagues in Congress to really codify some of this stuff, to make sure that it becomes law. And again, this is the sort of thing where, while I see only Republicans surrounding us today, we really have been able to work in some cases with Democratic governors and Democratic attorneys generals on the anti-fraud task force. And we would love, I'm not necessarily holding my breath, but we would love to work with Democrats in Washington to codify some of the anti-fraud actions that we've taken and to take it to the next level. There are a few things that we really need to do and that we can't do at the federal government without the cooperation of the Congress. And the first that I would say the most important of these is data sharing. So when we've looked at the anti-fraud efforts that we've taken, one of the weirdest and most difficult parts of this is the black box that exists around certain state programs. So for example, the SNAP program, which provides food resources to low-income people, it quite literally feeds hungry moms and children in our country, something that is very important and that I know every person at this table supports. We know that there is a lot of fraud in the SNAP program. We know that there are illegal aliens who benefit from the SNAP program, people who have no legal right to be in the country. We would like to stop that. But I think the American people would be shocked to learn, because I was certainly shocked when I learned it a few months ago, that when we send tax dollars to the states to administer the SNAP program, we have no visibility into who is ultimately getting those benefits. In other words, if the state of California gives those food stamp benefits to an illegal alien, to a violent criminal, the federal government has no visibility, and sometimes the states themselves have no visibility. So we need to work with Congress, and we need some legislation that would actually force some data sharing between the state governments and the federal governments. We need to know where your tax dollars are going. And if the state of California or the state of New York isn't going to tell us, we need Congress to force them to tell us. And I think that's the first and most important thing that we would like to do. The second is that we would like to see stiffer penalties for fraudsters. One of the things I said at the very beginning of the task force is that I was shocked by how often we would just let low-level fraud go. Like $1 million of fraud, that's a lot of money. A person who would enrich themselves to the tune of $1 million, sometimes we wouldn't even prosecute this stuff. And even when we do prosecute it, we are limited by the penalties applied. The most important thing that we can do in prosecuting fraud is to make sure that the people who engage in fraud actually suffer some real penalties. And so we would love to work with all of you and see some stiffer penalties for the people that we're successfully prosecuting. We are throwing a lot of people behind bars, but we're limited by in some ways by the statutes that exist. We'd like to change those statutes and actually make it harder for people to commit fraud, and make sure that when they do commit fraud, they go to jail, and they go to jail for a long time. And finally, we need a little bit of money, not a lot of money, and frankly, we're saving way more money than we're taking in, but the Fraud Task Force it involves every single agency of the federal government. Every single cabinet secretary has been great, and I want to give a special shout out to some of our all-stars, Bobby Kennedy at H&HS, Kelly Loeffler at SBA, Brooke at the Department of Agriculture. We've really had a whole of government. Our soon-to-be new Attorney General, Todd Blanche, has just been amazing to work with, and I know other people will say more about that. But we need a little bit of resources, because while we're saving the American people billions and billions of dollars, and we're not spending very much, we need a little bit more appropriated to expand this fraud effort. I think we'll save even more money in the process. It's the sort of investment that, unlike most of the money you guys spend, it never comes back to D.C. Every dollar you give us comes back at least 5 or 10-fold. So it's a good investment, and it's the sort of thing that we need to see happen. But without further ado, I want to kick it over to our amazing co-chair of the task force, Andrew Ferguson. You see him on TV. He's amazing. But most importantly, behind the scenes, when he's not on TV, he's doing amazing things for the American people. This whole thing would not work, and would not work as well were it not for Andrew's hard work. So great job. Great to see you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, and welcome to all my friends from the Senate and from the House. We're very pleased that you're here. I want to thank President Trump for creating this task force and assembling us here today. He is the first president in American history to take this fraud issue, which is an existential crisis for the American Republic, seriously, and none of this would have been possible without you.
Wow, that is crazy, guys.